right, Travis. Okay, good evening. Hey, smiling faces this evening. I got a few announcements. Boss, Gerald Rain will stay there. See, Edinburgh still improving. Here in Garland is October the 5th. Our win change to 6:30 p.m. Mrs. Jones not feeling. If you have a couple, you are invited to attend an area-wide day. This will be a influences of others. Okay, if you have any is this Friday is our fish. You know that you're willing to serve and to fill some holes that need to be filled, and so prayer. I want to acknowledge that today. Prayer, and we'll be day to you, and oh, happy birthday to you. I really wish you could see him. He turned really red there. Yeah, you're welcome. Our God, we know that all things come from you and all blessings come through your Son. God, we thank you for your promises that you give us eternal life in heaven. And that we can have that hope and we can have life in you, Father. Those of our members that are sick, that are down or feeling sick or just bad. just thank you for this hour that we're able to come together as your church. And God, we pray that all things in common. Help us to always we just thank you again for your Son.
about Timothy was that he had a genuine interest in he obviously wanted to share the gospel with as many people as he could. But Timothy also had a genuine interest in the Philippian church. And as I thought about that, I'm teaching this. I mean, the Fair Daily Preacher's here to do the devotion. Okay? But one of the things we talked about as we were talking, we've been studying Philippians. But you have to have a genuine interest in other people. I think it's interesting here that he talks about Timothy having a genuine interest in the welfare of the Philippian church. And as I thought about that, I thought, would someone say that about me as a Christian? And I think that's a question we all need to ask ourselves. Would someone say about me, or about Bill, or about Van, or about Travis, they have a genuine interest in other people? I think that's something I need to try to measure up to as a Christian. Do people see me as someone who has a genuine interest in their welfare? Okay? So we see that here with Timothy, and Paul points that out. And he wanted to develop in other people a genuine interest. That they had a genuine interest in the welfare of others. The other thing I think is interesting here in this passage is he talks about Epaphroditus. Now, Epaphroditus was from the Philippian church. They had sent him there to help Paul.
All right, turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 25. Exodus 25. We're going to cover tonight and next week, Lord willing, the tabernacle, which, like I said last week, and by the way, ladies, we're really proud you're here. You make the class look much better. But last week I talked about, you already fixed it? Well, look at there. Okay, thank you. Sometimes you wish they would look at it just a little bit longer, you know? And if you remember last week, 20, the book of Deuteronomy. And you can see there some of the ideas, and you can't see it very well. But we're studying 10 Commandments. We're going to study the tabernacle for 2 weeks. This week, we're going to study the physical tabernacle. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to talk about how it is a representative of Christ. Next week, depending on just what kind of mood we're in. But one of the interesting things is in the Old Testament, the Lord really never commanded a temple to be built. He allowed it to be built, but there's never a command. When you bring it there. And you'll run into some stuff. And we'll talk about the pro and the negative of that. Weeks 4 and 5, Leviticus 1 through 4. Yom Kippur, or the 6, we're going to talk about the high priest who was chosen. You remember who the oldest of the 12 was? Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Remember that? Okay, Reuben and Simeon got in trouble with Joseph and with other things. Levi did as well. Levi got reinstated. They defended Moses and defended the Lord. And so they were chosen as Levites. And so that leaves number 4, who would be Judah. And so the king came through Judah. But we'll talk about that a little bit, and we'll talk about Aaron and all of Aaron's sons and what each one of the sons did. We may, that'll all be next week. Probably we'll talk about that a little bit in the tabernacle. And then we're going to talk about the sacred feast and the times and what they could eat, the dietary laws, the Ark of the Covenant. Lesson 10, we're going to talk about cities of refuge and capital punishment, the ways in which they would punish. Remember, they didn't have jails in the Old Testament. We're going to talk about how they could make it without a jail. 11 is we might have some murmuring going on in the class, so we're going to study that. And then hopefully they'll fix it, because the next week we're studying rebellion. And then after that we'll study the death of Moses and also the book of Deuteronomy. We talked last week, if you remember, the role of the Old Testament, right? These things which were written before for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. We talked about how it was nailed to the cross, but it teaches us many of the major doctrines. We did a little bit of introduction. Moses freed his people, the 10 plagues, and how it's the basis of our law today, and how it is it's what we follow in as far as our American law. So you go to the Supreme Court, and you look above at all the influences upon American law, and right there, smack in the middle, you're going to have Moses and his 10 Commandments. And so even though it's outlawed at most courthouses, it seems, and many state houses, it's still on the Supreme Court. They haven't taken it off yet, but give them time, right? And so we talked about that, and then we hit that big question. Are we under the 10 Commandments today? And that's a tough question. It's one you always bring up whenever you're doing Bible studies, because most people think, well, sure, we're under the 10 Commandments today. We talked about how all 10 are repeated in the New Testament, except, there's that number again, the 4th one, right? The keeping the Sabbath day holy. But we also talked about how the Old Testament is done away with, and the 10 Commandments fit in the Old Testament. So we looked at Romans 7 and saw where Moses mentioned a command, thou shalt not covet. I don't know if he spoke in King James English, but he should have, right? And he said that was part of the law, which has been done away with. We talked about over in the book of Colossians, chapter 2 and verse 14, about how that law had been nailed to the cross. And we spent some time in James chapter 2 and talked about how every part of law had to go together. You either had all of it or none of it. And so we talked about how the Old Testament had been nailed to the cross. Therefore, you and I today, we are not under the 10 Commandments. The old law is given to us presence of God, but we are not. And I'm sorry, it was too small as we looked at it. We talked about how every one of these commandments are repeated in the New Testament. And when we closed, we talked, blame it on the guy who did the Devo last week and say he took too much time. That won't work because that was me too. But you go and talk about there not being a Sabbath. There actually is a Sabbath. All right, who is our Sabbath according to Hebrews 3 and 4? Who is it that gives us the rest? It's Jesus. Jesus gives us the rest. And so we recognize his day. Now, is Sunday the Christian Sabbath? No. We're never told anywhere in the New Testament that you're not to work on Sunday, right? In verse, took together contributions 1 and 2. That's where we see an example of the church and worship. Acts chapter 2 and verse 40. Even when he was alone. When you look in the very first chapter of the book of Revelation, he says he was caught up on the Spirit on the Lord's day. Even in Greece today, if you go over there and hang out with them, they've got really good food, I've heard. If it's Sunday, they call it Curio Day. In other words, it's the day of the Lord. That's their name for the Sunday, even over there. So the church worships on the first day of the week, but it's not the Christian Sabbath. The Sabbath, as far as its heritage and everything, has been done away with. All right? Any questions about last week? It's fun teaching the auditorium class. All right. Okay, we're going to talk about this tabernacle. And hopefully these pictures will come through all right. The tabernacle, okay? Now, a word for tabernacle is tent, right? And we're going to talk about this a little bit more next week, but this is all going to prefigure Christ. We go to John chapter 1, and you see the Word became flesh, and the Word did what among us? Dwelt, okay? The literal word there for the Word became flesh and the Word dwelt among us, the literal word is he was a tabernacle among us. So what the writer of John is doing is he's going back to the Old Testament and saying, remember this tabernacle, and it was, in the minds of the Israelites, the presence of God. Because when they wandered through the wilderness, what guided them? The cloud during the day and the fire by night, right? And so that's what guided them. Now, when they were parked and they set up, and they actually set up, a lot of times they set up for many years in the same place, that fire and that cloud would actually reside above the tabernacle. Now, what's interesting to me, the center of worship for the Israelites in the wilderness operates as a good biblical example, which is there. Now, what's the size of the tabernacle? This is something that kind of set me back a little bit. Do you see it anywhere on those little sheets? 150 foot by 50. Hopefully you don't get so bored in a sermon you count ceiling tiles. And if you do, shame on you, all right? But if you look up, you see these ceiling tiles here. These are square, and so they are 2 foot square. So anytime you want to figure out dimensions, you can start working with those. If you go from the front to the back, now this does not mean I've been bored in church, okay? You go from the front to the back, you'll hit about 34 ceiling tiles. And so what you have in here in the auditorium is about the width of the entire court of the tabernacle, okay? Now you go in this direction, we're really just a little over 100 feet wide. So we are about 2/3 of the length of the tabernacle. Now I don't know why, I always thought it was bigger than that. And I don't know why I always thought that, but I always did. So if you're thinking, we're talking outer court here, okay? So and then about another third, if you'll add it, maybe if you start right there and go out to the parking lot where the division is there, where the grass is, that is about the size of the tabernacle that we're talking about. Now this is the outer edges or the outer courts that we're running across. And so it's mobile, it's designed to be temporary, and hopefully it's in each one of these pictures as we start looking at them. When you start looking at the laver and you start looking at the altar, you start looking at everything, you'll notice that until you get to the inside, everything on the outside, there are hoops on it. Or rings, I guess would be a better way to say that. They didn't hoop too much in the Old Testament, hopefully. They got in trouble whenever they did that. They had rings because that's how they would carry things, right? That's how the Ark of the Covenant was carried. Now, the table of showbread and also the menorah or the candlestick, they were oftentimes put on an ox cart. But the point I want us to look at is everything in the place is temporary. It's designed to be picked up and moved. So it's never planted on a foundation like what we would think a building being planted on. So wherever you are in a tabernacle, you're going to notice real quick of what it looks like. Now, it's built of curtains and fabric, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along as well. But it's pretty neat as we look at it that way. Now, is way too small to see. But the reason it's there is it's illustration, and it's not even an accurate illustration necessarily, of how the Israelites would camp around it. The tabernacle would always be in the center, and around each side of the tabernacle, 3 or 4 tribes would stay. And so they would all stay around there. So you'd have the 12. Now, one facing east. Guess which tribe that was? Who do you have to travel through to reach God? Not Levi, but Judah, okay? So you have that example of them going through Judah to enter into the gate. Now, all over the place, you're going to see a lot of prefiguring here. God leaves coming, but you always have Judah front and center right at the gate. And always in the back center, in the very back, you're always going to have Benjamin. And Benjamin is always in the back, and Benjamin is always the one as they are marching along, which has the job of protecting all the pieces of the tabernacle. But
question, one time somebody stole something, but he was of one of the tribes, and I think they all stood up.
right,
And the number was like 25,000. And
Right.
the ground opened up.
yes.
So each one of them little camps is like 25,000 people.
Yeah, I think you may be putting a couple of them together as far as the passages. But yeah, and see, that's the reason it's not accurate, because each one of these tribes is going to number anywhere from 25 to 48,000. You get to the Joseph's sons, which will be on the left and the right, who eventually will make the northern kingdom, Manasseh. They're going to be a lot bigger, and they're going to be a lot bigger. Now,
One thing, that
yeah,
number of people, is that counted fighting age men?
primarily.
Okay.
Now, you're going to have your numbering in the beginning of Numbers, and you're also going to have your numbering right at the end of Numbers, and you're going to see the difference, which is there. Also, the thing which was stolen, I think you're talking about Achan, where he stole it out of Jericho and hid the coat. He hid a coat and a talent of gold. And so those are the 2 things there. All right, so that's a little bit of an example, and of course it is idealized in the way it's put there. But you'll notice whenever they marched anywhere, God had an exact replica of exactly who walked in line, where they went, and everything else. So they were very pretty tight about it. All right, outer court, okay? This outer court, like we just talked about, 150 feet by 75 feet. So thinking about the width of the auditorium and the length, the entire area of it was white curtains. And so it would look white as you were looking at it from the outside. It was white until you got to the east gate, and for the gate was 30 feet wide. It was color. Purple, blue, and scarlet. Okay? Now, why would he make it white all the way around, but make more or less a dark red curtain that you had to go through in order to enter God's presence? What's being said there? Okay, more or less you have to go through the blood of Christ in order to be in God's presence, right? John 14:6, I'm the way, the truth, the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. Also in Acts chapter 4, there's no other way no other name given among men by which we must be saved than that which is of Jesus. All right, so it always faced the east, and the tabernacle was on the west side facing the east. Okay, and so more or less, it was always facing Jerusalem, or coming very close to facing Jerusalem in most of the areas in which they would be traveling in the wilderness. A little bit of an aside, I'm kind of an Acts 8:4 preacher. I go everywhere preaching the word. I don't stay focused, all right? A little bit of aside, people today, unless you're in a modern cemetery, are always buried facing east. You'll notice preachers get pretty worked up about it, and funeral home directors get pretty worked up about it. When you're getting in the hearse and out of the hearse, where's the head of the casket? Because we always want to bury people facing east. Anybody know why? Jesus returned and we were all pulled out of the grave. You sit up and you're going to see Jesus come. And so that's the idea, is you're always buried facing east, so you can get up and you don't have to turn around. Because by the time you resurrect a body, it would be so much trouble to turn around, wouldn't you think? And so they always bury them facing east.
So mom's good about
I think so. I think we're in good shape there. Now, the way the courtyard would work, any Israelite, any common Israelite was able to enter into the courtyard. Through that blood, you could pass through that short curtain to get into the presence of God to be able to offer up your sacrifice. To offer? Each family would come. So, yeah, the whole tribe would come, but they wouldn't all walk together. Like, for example, my family would have an offering. So, depending on my wealth, I could offer, a bull, a goat. I'd probably be on the pigeon side. No, not really. We'd all offer something. Remember Jesus' family, they offered the pigeon, right? Every family, so I would offer it for my family. Now, whoever's in your home, you would offer it for the folks that were in your home. And so, that sort of thing. Here in a few weeks, Lord willing, because once you start figuring up these sacrifices, all these people offering these bulls and their blood, this place got really gross and really stinky really quick. Josephus in his Annals, the big Josephus book that people buy but never read, just about every church library. A time when everybody would come and offer. And he would say, which he was open to exaggeration oftentimes, but around the area of the temple, he would say the blood would get to the point where it was knee deep because so many bulls had been sacrificed. And you'll see oftentimes where Solomon, as he is getting ready to inaugurate the temple, thousands upon thousands of bulls. So just imagine the blood, the gore, and just the absolute nastiness of what's going on there. It makes me glad I'm not a Jew. Because, man, remember when I started ministry, I went to visit a guy, and he had a slaughterhouse in there, and I turned around and walked right back out and thought, I'll see that guy at church. They did, and I thought, man, good grief. You mean for the entire nation? Well, each family would, you were responsible for your family. Yes. Solomon was more or less showing off. That's the way I would put it. You open up in Chronicles, he's showing off his wealth and just how much he loves this temple being built. Because this temple was almost as much about him as it was God. At least it appears that way when you begin reading about it. But yeah, he probably could have got away with one or two, but he really wanted to have a big, big thing going on there when he sacrificed and did that. It was a huge deal that he had. All right, this is the outer court. There you see, even though it's not able to be seen very well, the off color, those would be the curtains where you could go in, where you could enter there. Now, let's talk about some of the individual parts. There is what's called the bronze altar. If you'll notice, as we read through here, as you read through it on your own or read through the notes, everything in the courtyard is covered in what? Bronze, right? Once you get inside the tabernacle, everything's going to be covered in gold. So you got those two differences. Outside it's bronze, inside it's going to be covered with gold when we get there. But if you'll look at the altar here, and of course this is just a facsimile, we don't know where you could carry it. And also you'll notice there are little pointy things all around. On each corner has a pointy thing. It's a horn. And this is where the blood would be sprinkled as they were doing their sacrifice. They would, and this is a little bit of a preview. I don't remember who I was talking to about the preview on the sacrifices. I said, I think I'm just going to get a stuffed cow and we're going to sacrifice it, but we're not going to. I was trying to figure it out, but I got a lot of weeks till we figure it out. They'd get a cow, drain all the blood over to the side, right? Up on top of the altar, and then you would slice it, and then you would take out the organs that are unclean, the intestines and the other things that you more or less clean whenever you're working on a deer. It's about to be deer season. You clean all that out. And then you would lay different parts out for some. Look in 1 Samuel chapter 1, you see where Hophni and Phinehas, they had some issues. Establish each part of it, and then you'd have the part that you would burn, and that would be there. Now, as they were doing all this, some of them would put their hand within the blood that was pouring out of the throat, and they would lay it upon the altar, the horns which were there. And as a way of giving it to God. The horns represent the power and the strength of God. And so out there in the middle of that courtyard, so this is where you see the business end, if you will. And also, this area, this is where you see the action happening in the tabernacle. This is the part that they're going to be aware of. They're going to see the priests in the back, but they're not going to really see very much of it. It's all happening right here. And so that's your bronze altar, which is going on. It was a place for sacrifices to be made. We can play with Hebrew a little bit. The word Hebrew that they use for altar means the killing place or to slay. The word altar, which we use today, comes from a Latin root, and it means a high place. The Catholic Church primarily, or an old church, one of those old denominational churches, and they have what's called the altar. Made a big deal, I think in the 1955 or 1960, they made a decree to move the pulpit or the altar over to the side, so it's not in the middle anymore. So you'll notice that when you go into some old buildings and stuff. But the altar is a big place where you'd see a lot of stuff happen. Now behind the altar is the sink. Now, of course, they didn't have modern day plumbing like we do, right? And each priest, every time before he would fulfill some duty, whatever duty it is he's doing, whether it be in the most holy place, or whether it be out here, he was under requirement to go and wash his hands. And it wasn't like the soap sort of business. It was a ceremonial washing. He would wash his hands, and then he also had to wash his feet. And so it's an idea of cleansing himself before God, before, see where it's right before the tabernacle proper. He would have to wash himself to make himself clean before God before he could go and offer a sacrifice, or before he would go and work with the showbread or the menorah or whatever else it may be. And so you would have, if you were a regular Jew, say we were regular Jews, and you walked in, you would be around the altar watching your guy sacrifice whatever you brought in. In the back, you would see priests going back and forth everywhere, and everybody would be washing over and over and going through that. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit next week. Sometimes people point to that laver, that sink, and they say that represents baptism. And so that is one of the arguments for effusion. That is sprinkling or pouring to be baptism, because a person wouldn't immerse himself completely in order to wash himself. Now, is that a good argument to say that baptism is not immersion? No, that does not represent immersion, because immersion is what adds us to the Lord's church. Our obedience through baptism adds us to the Lord's church, 1 Peter 3:21. These priests, are they already in the church, or are they already outside the church? Are they already in the represent baptism? It talks about the continual washing away of the filth of the flesh, okay? Think of 1 John chapter 1 and verse 7. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship. Jesus Christ cleanses or pours over us, right? And so I would think more of the 1 John 1:7 and that continual cleansing that comes from Christ than I would baptism when we were there. Does that make sense? Does that work okay? That's kind of what we've got going. So it's kind of a rough thing. You have Old Testament authority for men to have to do the dishes. That just hurts right there, doesn't it? What does it they say? The Bible also says that the men have to make the coffee because what's that book? Hebrews, right? Man, this Bible study is tough. All right. Now we get to the actual tabernacle. Now the tabernacle is a little bit different. What's the dimensions on the tabernacle? 45 by 15. 45 long, 15 wide. So you would start at that wall and you would end up about right here. That would be about 45. And if you go against that wall right there, the back of the pulpit, about here. So your tabernacle is only compared to what we usually think. When I think of a tabernacle, at least in my colloquial mindset, I think of something as big at least as this church building. But that tabernacle area is really only about this big. It's not a huge place. It'll be a little bit bigger when we get to the temple. But as far as the tabernacle goes, 45 by 15. And so that's a little bit of what you see as far as the entire tent, which is there. It's covered by 4 layers of skin. And when you run into Christian apologists, boy, we spend a lot of time with this. The outer skin is porpoise skin. All right? Porpoise. It sounds like one of the Three Stooges talking about his main goal in life, right? This is my porpoise. No, this is the little sea creature. And a lot of people have attacked the Bible because they say, what in the world are they doing in the wilderness, in the desert, coming up with porpoise skins? Well, as a matter of fact, there's a lot of porpoises hanging out down there in the Gulf of Aqaba and down there around the Suez area today. And so it actually wouldn't be that hard to come up with those skins. Now, of course, those skins would be very, very waterproof, and they also would last a long time. But sometimes if you read older things which are attacking the Bible, you're going to run across those porpoise skins. But underneath the porpoise skins, you also will have ram skin, which is dyed red. That would be a leather, which was underneath that. Underneath that, you would have a kind of a rough-looking quilt, and it was goat's hair, and it would be there. And then on the 4th layer, what you would see from the inside would be fine linen. And this is interesting. God had a special artisan who was filled with the Spirit to draw them correctly. All over on the inside of the tabernacle, you would see cherubim. Now, if you recall, you got your classes of angels, right? We studied classes of angels in here 3 years ago, and I bet we all remember it really well, okay? You got many different classes. Let's just do the 3 general. We'll throw out archangels for now, just the 3 general. You've got your ones that look like men, right? They're the ones who appeared to Mary and appeared to Gideon's parents, appeared to Samson's parents. You got those. And then you have cherubim and seraphim. Seraphim, you run across them where? Isaiah 6, right? They've got 2 sets of wings, right? Or they got 3 sets of wings. I'm sorry, they got 3 sets of wings. And what happens with the seraphim is they cover their eyes, they cover their feet, and with the other 2, they fly around. And they're always in the presence of God. Their job is to worship. Even though that they look like different beasts, they're always worshiping God. And in Isaiah's case, they bring him a coal to purify, right? That's your seraphim. Now your cherubim. Cherubim have 4 sets of wings, which just makes them go really fast, kind of like a dragonfly. Who guarded the Garden of Eden? You remember? It's the cherubim. The cherubim are of the angels as you go across. Now, they all could pretty much whoop folks, but the cherubim were kind of the fighting force. Whole lot different than the fat babies you see at Christmas and the dolls, right? You know, when you be careful with that. I'm kidding. But they were usually the fighters. But you'll see cherubim here. They're on the inside of the thing. All right. This thing, 45 feet long, contains 2 rooms. What are they? The holy and the what? Most holy. That's right. And so that's kind of what you run across. Here's the holy place, which you have here. Now, out of the 45 feet, 2/3 of it are included in the holy place. And in the 2/3 of it, you're going to have 30 feet by 15 feet. Okay? Now, the outer courts, of course, everything was bronze. Inside, every Jewish, you could enter into the courtyard to see your animal sacrificed. You could go into that area. Who is allowed to go into the holy place? Okay, only the priest. All right, the high priests are the ones who will go into the most holy place. But only the priest could enter into this area. Now, this area is really fascinating when you start looking at it because there. Now, you don't read about the furniture temple time, and there's several temples, right? You got Solomon's temple, you got Zechariah's temple, you got Herod's temple, and then you see the temple in Revelation. And some people include the temple in the book of Ezekiel. There's 3 pieces of furniture. The very first piece you're going to run into, well, we'll get there in a little bit. Let's go ahead. You'll rock in, and you'll look to the side, and you'll see what's called the table of showbread. Okay? It's a regular table. It would look a lot like our, I think I rang there. Look a lot like our communion table. And it would always have 12 loaves. And those loaves would be traded out every Sabbath day. But it was always bread being offered up to God and to God's people and for God's work. And so you'd always have that bread which was there. Now, what did that represent? God provides for his people, right? What did Jesus say about himself? I am the what? Bread of life. Okay, so you'd have that there. Now, on the other side, we see the menorah, right? A menorah is a large candlestick. Now, the golden lampstand is pretty a lot. The thing is huge. Each one of the bowls are made in the shape of an almond blossom, and it's been estimated to be around worth a little over $5.5 million. So that is one expensive lampstand right there, isn't it? Okay. You see why when Hezekiah showed the servant from Babylon all the articles of the temple, why they went back home and said, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, we got to go check these guys out. Let's go visit them and take their stuff. You see why they came back. All right, what's the purpose of the golden lampstand? Are there a lot of windows in here? You got 4 layers of skins going over it. So it's going to, and so this would be the only source of light both in the holy place and the most holy place. And they had a pretty fancy way of lighting it. And if you recall, if you are into the history of the period between the Testaments, you'll remember that they lit it and it continued to burn for many more days than it should have. Now, because there's a King James issue here. King James oftentimes call them candlesticks, all right? They didn't have candles back at that time. It was more of a lamp, like a kerosene lamp, sort of what we think of, although it didn't have the glass on it that it would burn with. Are any of y'all, not that you're old, we don't have old people in here. Any of y'all remember those lamps that used whale oil? Have y'all seen those? Whale? Okay, what were y'all used to? Kerosene? Okay, see, we're young. We're young. That's good. Okay. But they would work off this oil and they'd be able to burn it. Altar of incense. Imagine the most holy places right here, and you got your next, your curtain that you would enter into. Right in front of that would be, it looked like a bowl, and they would pour incense there, and they would light it, and it would make a whole lot of smoke. That smoke would come out of the front of the tabernacle at all the times, and so it was almost hard to breathe sometimes when you're in this area. Okay. I'm almost done. And so that was the way in which they would light the place, and it was always a fragrant offering before God. But they also would use it to, on the Day of Atonement, fill the most holy place up with smoke to the point where you couldn't see anything. Because the point is, when the high priest goes in the holy place to offer up some of that blood, he would get the blood from this front altar, he would dip his hand into it, and then he would walk through to the top of the ark, and he would sprinkle that blood upon the top, the mercy seat between those two seraphim that are worshiping the Lord. But they would make it where it was so smoky that he would not be able to necessarily see where he was going, as a point of saying, God is so holy, I can't look upon his face. All right, thanks for being here. And next week, we're going to look at how each one of these works as an analogy towards Jesus Christ. Okay? Yeah.
You were talking about the pork skin and all that.
Yes.
It's the first time I've ever heard of it.
The porpoise skins?
Or any of the four coverings.
Okay.
Had four coverings.